Eleanor Caldwell's fingers trembled as she signed her name to the contract, her father's heavy hand resting on her shoulder like an iron shackle. In Montana Territory, 1876, a woman's worth was measured in acres, and Eleanor had just discovered her precise value. 500 acres of prime grazing land that would expand her father's empire in Whitetail Valley. "That's my girl," George Caldwell said, his voice carrying the false warmth he reserved for business dealings. "Mr. Thornton here is a fine man. You'll make him a proper wife." Eleanor stared at Thornton, 40 years her senior, with yellowed teeth and eyes that crawled over her like insects. The enormity of what was happening crashed down upon her. At 19, she was being traded away like cattle, her dreams of teaching in a proper school evaporating like morning dew under the harsh western sun. "The wedding will be in 2 weeks, Thornton declared, rolling up the contract. "Just enough time for you to prepare a proper trousseau, Miss Caldwell." 2 weeks is hardly," Eleanor began, only to be silenced by her father's fingers digging into her shoulder. "2 weeks is perfect," George Caldwell replied. "My daughter is most eager to begin her new life." Eleanor felt a scream building in her chest as her father and Thornton shook hands. The room began to spin, the oak-paneled walls of her father's study closing in. She had known this day would come. Her father had been hinting at it since her mother died 3 years ago, but she had foolishly believed she might have some say in her own fate. "May I be excused?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Her father nodded, already turning his attention to pouring celebratory whiskey with Thornton. Neither man noticed as she slipped from the room, her footsteps quickening until she was running through the sprawling ranch house and out into the yard. The vast Montana sky that had always represented freedom now seemed to mock her, stretching endlessly above a life that would soon be confined to Thornton's remote ranch, 20 miles north. Eleanor stumbled toward the stables, seeking refuge in the only place that had ever truly felt like hers. The sweet scent of hay and horseflesh enveloped her as she collapsed onto a bale, finally allowing her tears to flow freely. "Miss Caldwell." A deep voice interrupted her sobs. Eleanor hastily wiped her eyes, mortified to be discovered in such a state. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, was a man she'd never seen before. Tall and lean, with a battered hat in his hands, he regarded her with a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "I beg your pardon, madam," he said, taking a step back. "I was told to report to the stables when I arrived." "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, straightening her posture and attempting to regain her composure. "Yates Zachary, madam. Your father hired me on as the new horse trainer." His voice carried a slight southern drawl, remnants of a life before the war, perhaps. Eleanor noticed his eyes, then startlingly blue against sun-bronzed skin, and the respectful way he kept his distance. Unlike most cowboys who would have either fled in awkward haste or approached with unwelcome familiarity upon finding a woman alone. "Well, Mr. Zachary, you've caught me at a disadvantage," she said, smoothing her skirts. "Please don't let me keep you from your duties." He nodded but didn't move, his gaze steady. "Begging your pardon, Miss Caldwell, but it seems to me that whatever's troubling you might benefit from a friendly ear. Sometimes strangers make the best confidants." Eleanor almost laughed at the absurdity, confiding in a ranch hand she'd just met. Yet something in his direct gaze made her consider it. What did she have to lose? In 2 weeks, she'd be property of Bartholomew Thornton, a man who collected wives like hunting trophies. "My father has just sold me to the largest landowner north of here in exchange for expanding our ranch," she said bluntly, watching for his reaction. Yates Zachary didn't flinch, didn't offer platitudes. Instead, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see," he said finally. "And when is this transaction to be completed?" 2 weeks. The wedding is in 2 weeks. The word wedding stuck in her throat like a bone. Zachary set his hat on a nearby post and leaned against the stable door. 2 weeks is time enough, he said cryptically. "Time enough for what, Mr. Zachary?" "Time enough to find another way," he replied, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "If you were looking for one." Eleanor stared at him, this stranger offering dangerous words that matched the desperate thoughts swirling in her own mind. "What do you know of my situation?" she asked cautiously. "I know Thornton," he replied, his expression darkening. "I worked his ranch last year. I know what happened to his last wife." A chill ran through Eleanor. Thornton's previous wife had allegedly fallen from a horse, though rumors had circulated suggesting a far more sinister fate. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Zachary?" Before he could answer, the stable door swung wide and Eleanor's father's foreman, Jenkins, strode in. "There you are, Zachary. Mr. Caldwell wants to see what you can do with that new stallion right away." Jenkins nodded curtly to Eleanor. "Miss Caldwell, your father is asking for you in the house." Eleanor rose, smoothing her skirts once more. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I was just getting some air." As she passed Yates Zachary, he touched the brim of his hat respectfully, but his eyes conveyed a message. This conversation wasn't over. For the next 3 days, Eleanor found herself watching for the new horse trainer. Their paths crossed briefly several times in the yard, near the corral, once in the kitchen where he'd come for water, but never alone enough to continue their interrupted conversation. Yet each time, his eyes found hers with silent understanding that left her both unsettled and strangely comforted. On the 4th day, a note appeared tucked into her favorite book in the parlor. Cottonwood Creek, sunset. The handwriting was rough but clear, and Eleanor knew immediately who had written it. She shouldn't go. Meeting a man she barely knew, alone at dusk, was beyond improper. It was dangerous. Yet as she folded the note into her palm, Eleanor knew she would be at Cottonwood Creek when the sun touched the distant mountains. Claiming a headache, Eleanor retired to her room after dinner, only to slip out through her window once the house grew quiet. The well-worn path to Cottonwood Creek was easy enough to follow even as twilight deepened into dusk. The burbling of the creek guided her the final yards to where Yates Zachary waited, 2 horses ground tied nearby. "You came," he said simply. "I shouldn't have," Eleanor replied, glancing back toward the ranch house, now hidden beyond a gentle rise. "No, you probably shouldn't have," he agreed, surprising her, "but I'm glad you did. We don't have much time." "Time for what, Mr. Zachary? Why all this secrecy?" Yates removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that curled slightly at the collar. "Miss Caldwell, I'm not just a horse trainer. I came to your father's ranch specifically looking for you." Eleanor took an instinctive step back. "What do you mean?" "I'm working with the territorial marshal's office, unofficially." He reached into his vest and produced a folded document. "Bartholomew Thornton is wanted for questioning in the deaths of 2 of his wives." Not enough evidence for a formal charge yet, but enough for the marshal to be concerned when he heard about your upcoming marriage. Eleanor's heart pounded as she took the paper, unfolding it to reveal a wanted circular with Thornton's likeness and the words "person of interest" above it. "My father doesn't know," she whispered, the realization dawning coldly. "Or he doesn't care," Yates said, his voice gentle but unflinching. "Either way, you can't go through with this marriage. What choice do I have? The contract is signed." "My father would run away," Yates interrupted, gesturing to the horses. "Tonight, I can get you to Helena, where the marshal can offer protection until the investigation into Thornton concludes." Eleanor stared at him, this stranger proposing to completely upend her life. "Why would you risk this for me?" Something flickered across his features, pain, perhaps, or memory. "Because I couldn't save someone else once, because no one should be traded like property." He paused, then added softly, "Because when I saw you in that stable, I recognized something I understand too well, the look of someone trapped in a cage with the door closing." The sincerity in his voice reached something deep inside Eleanor. All her life, she'd followed rules, been the dutiful daughter, even after her mother's death left her alone to manage her father's household. The thought of defying everything she knew terrified her, yet the alternative life with Thornton terrified her more. "If I go with you," she said carefully, "what happens after Helena? What becomes of me if Thornton isn't arrested?" Yates stepped closer, his eyes earnest in the fading light. "Freedom, Miss Caldwell, whatever you decide. I have a sister in California. She runs a school for girls. She'd welcome a new teacher if that's still your dream." Eleanor's breath caught. He'd remembered her offhand mention of teaching from their brief conversation days ago. "How long do I have to decide?" minutes, he replied grimly. Jenkins saw me leaving the note. He's loyal to your father first. We need to be miles from here before dawn. The reality of what he was proposing crashed over Eleanor. Leaving would mean abandoning everything she knew, becoming effectively an outlaw against her father's will. Staying meant a life, likely a short one, with a man who may have murdered his previous wives. I don't even know you, she whispered. No, Yates agreed, you don't. But sometimes freedom comes from unlikely sources. The choice is yours, Miss Caldwell, but it needs to be made now. Eleanor looked toward the horses, then back to the distant shape of the ranch house where she'd spent her entire life. In that moment, she thought of her mother, a gentle woman who had withered under her father's domineering presence year by year until illness finally claimed her. Was that to be Eleanor's fate as well? I'll need to leave a note, she said firmly. I won't have my father sending a search party thinking I've been kidnapped. Relief washed over Yates's features. He produced a small journal and pencil from his saddlebag. Make it brief. We need to be riding within minutes. Eleanor's hand trembled as she wrote. Father, I cannot and will not marry Mr. Thornton. By the time you read this, I will be far from here. Do not look for me. Eleanor. Yates took the note, promising to leave it where it would be found in the morning. Then he helped her mount one of the horses, a steady mare with a smooth gait. Stay close and follow my lead, he instructed, swinging onto his own horse. We'll ride south tonight, then cut east before dawn. There's an old trapper's cabin where we can rest tomorrow. As they rode away from Cottonwood Creek, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. The night air carried the scent of sage and pine, and overhead, stars blazed in patterns she'd known all her life, but somehow seemed different now, no longer fixtures in a static sky, but guides to an unknown future. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. Yates proved to be a skilled guide, navigating by stars and landmarks visible only to his experienced eye. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, crossing into a rugged region of pine forests and rocky outcroppings where pursuit would be difficult. The trapper's cabin was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a stone hearth and rough plank floor, but to Eleanor's exhausted eyes, it looked like sanctuary. Yates tended to the horses while she gathered wood for a small fire. We should be safe here for the day, he said, ducking through the low doorway with saddlebags slung over his shoulder. I doubt they'll track us this far, but we'll move on after dark. Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation now that they were confined in the small space together. As if reading her thoughts, Yates set his bedroll near the door, as far from the hearth where she would sleep as the cabin allowed. Try to rest, he said, handing her a canteen and some dried beef from his provisions. We have another long night ahead. As she settled onto her makeshift bed, Eleanor studied her unlikely rescuer. Tell me the truth, Mr. Zachary. Are you really working with the marshal? Yates paused in the middle of cleaning his revolver. Yes, he said after a moment. Though as I said, unofficially. Marshal Wells and I served together during the war. When rumors about Thornton reached him, he asked me to investigate discreetly. And inserting yourself as a horse trainer at my father's ranch, a ghost of a smile crossed his face. Fortunate timing. I heard about the position in town the same day I learned of your impending marriage. Eleanor wrapped her arms around her knees, contemplating this strange turn of events. You mentioned someone you couldn't save. Who were they? The question seemed to catch him off guard, his hands stilled on his weapon and his gaze fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls. My sister, he said finally. Not the one in California, my younger sister, Grace. He fell silent, and Eleanor thought he might not continue. Then, in a voice roughened by memory, he spoke again. Our father lost everything after the war: land, reputation, hope. He started drinking, gambling. One night, he wagered Grace in a poker game. She was 16. His jaw tightened. He lost. Oh, Mr. Zachary, Eleanor breathed, horror washing through her. I was away, working cattle drives in Texas. By the time I returned home, she was gone, married to a man 30 years her senior who'd taken her to Colorado. He reassembled his revolver with quick, practiced movements. I tracked them for months, but by the time I found where they'd been, Grace was buried on a windswept hillside outside Denver. The cabin fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Eleanor found herself blinking back tears for a girl she'd never known. "That's why you're helping me," she said softly. "Because of Grace." Yates nodded once, a sharp movement. "No one should be traded away like property," he repeated his earlier words. "Not Grace, not you." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of understanding, perhaps, or the first fragile threads of trust being woven. Eleanor realized that in Yates Zachary, she had found not just a rescuer, but a person who truly comprehended the depth of her predicament. "You should sleep now," he said, moving toward the door. "I'll keep watch." As Eleanor drifted into exhausted slumber, her last thought was that for the first time in years, she felt something unexpected: hope. They continued their journey east for 3 more nights, avoiding main trails and settlements. By day, they sheltered in abandoned homesteads or dense copses of trees, speaking little but growing increasingly comfortable in each other's presence. Eleanor discovered that Yates was well-read despite his rough exterior, and their conversations gradually expanded beyond immediate concerns to literature, politics, and the changing face of the West. On the 4th morning, as they made camp in a rocky alcove overlooking a vast prairie, Yates announced they would reach Helena by the following night. "Marshall Wells will meet us there," he said, spreading out a crude map on a flat stone. "From there, you'll have choices to make." Eleanor nodded, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The prospect of reaching Helena, their destination for days now, suddenly filled her with unexpected melancholy. What would become of her tentative connection with this quiet, honorable man once they reached civilization? "What will you do?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "After Helena, I mean." Yates folded the map deliberately, avoiding her gaze. "Back to work, I suppose. The Marshal always has need of men willing to operate in the shadows. It seems a lonely life." He looked up then, his blue eyes reflecting the morning light. "It suits me well enough." Eleanor wasn't convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she busied herself with organizing their meager breakfast. They ate in companionable silence until a distant sound caught Yates's attention. He rose swiftly, moving to the edge of their elevated position. "Riders," he said, voice taut. 3 of them moving fast. Eleanor joined him, squinting at the dust cloud rising from the prairie below. "Could it be my father's men, possibly, or Thornton's?" Yates's hand moved to his holster. "Either way, they're following our trail. We need to move. Now." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, erasing signs of their presence as best they could. Yates led them down the back side of the rocky outcropping and into a dense stand of cottonwoods that followed a dry creek bed. "If we can reach the Blackfoot River," he said, helping Eleanor mount, "we can use the water to cover our tracks and make better time to Helena." They rode hard, pushing their tired horses to a gallop whenever the terrain allowed. By midday, the sound of pursuit had faded, but Yates remained vigilant, frequently checking their back trail and changing direction to confuse any trackers. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, they crested a ridge and saw the silver ribbon of the Blackfoot River gleaming in the valley below. Eleanor felt a surge of relief until Yates suddenly raised his hand in warning. "Riders ahead," he murmured, pointing to a spot where the river narrowed between rocky banks. "They've guessed our route." Eleanor's heart sank as she made out 3 mounted figures positioned at the river crossing. "What now?" Yates surveyed their options, expression grim. "We'll have to try crossing farther upstream where the river widens. It'll be more dangerous, but they won't expect it." As they turned their mounts toward the north, a sharp crack split the air. A bullet whined past them, striking a tree trunk inches from Eleanor's head. "They've seen us." Yates urged his horse forward, reaching across to grab Eleanor's reins. "Ride, stay low in the saddle." They plunged down the ridge, zigzagging through trees as more shots rang out behind them. Eleanor's world narrowed to the pounding of hooves and the whistle of bullets through foliage. She followed Yates's lead instinctively, ducking beneath branches and leaning into turns as they raced toward the river. When they burst from the tree line, the Blackfoot lay before them, wider here but running fast and deep. Yates didn't hesitate, guiding his horse straight into the churning water. Eleanor followed, gasping as cold water rose to her knees, then her waist as her mare struggled against the current. "Keep moving," Yates called, his voice nearly lost in the rush of water. "Don't let her stop." Halfway across, Eleanor's horse stumbled on a submerged rock, nearly throwing her. She clutched the saddle horn, fighting panic as water swirled around her. Yates wheeled back, reaching for her bridle just as shouts erupted from the bank behind them. Their pursuers had arrived, 3 men Eleanor recognized as Thornton's ranch hands. The leader, a burly man with a scar bisecting his cheek, raised his rifle. "Caldwell girl," he shouted. "Your father wants you home. Come peaceful-like and we won't harm your friend here. Keep moving," Yates said quietly, positioning himself between Eleanor and the gunmen. "Don't stop for anything." "But they'll shoot you," she protested. "They'll try," he replied, drawing his revolver. "Get to the far bank and ride north. Helena's less than 10 miles. Ask for Marshal Wells at the territorial office." Before Eleanor could argue further, Yates fired 3 rapid shots toward the men on shore, forcing them to dive for cover. In that moment of confusion, he slapped Eleanor's horse hard on the rump, sending it lurching forward through the water. "Go," he shouted, turning to face the pursuers who were now returning fire. Eleanor's mare scrambled up the far bank, water streaming from its flanks. She turned in the saddle, horrified to see Yates still in the river, exchanging fire with the men on the opposite shore. As she watched, he swung his mount around and began making his way toward her, bullets kicking up water around him. Then it happened. Yates jerked suddenly, his hat flying off as a shot found its mark. He slumped forward in his saddle, but somehow maintained his seat as his horse struggled the remaining distance to shore. "Yates," Eleanor cried, dismounting and rushing to him as his horse staggered onto dry land. Blood streamed from a furrow along his temple, but his eyes were clear as he straightened in the saddle. "It's nothing, just a graze. We need to keep moving before they find a crossing." Eleanor tore a strip from her petticoat, pressing it against his wound. "You could have been killed." "Not the first time someone's tried," he said, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace. "But we're losing time. Can you ride? Can you?" she countered, helping him secure the makeshift bandage. In answer, Yates urged his horse forward, and Eleanor quickly remounted her mare. They rode north along the riverbank, pushing their exhausted mounts as hard as they dared. Behind them, they could hear Thornton's men shouting as they searched for a safe place to cross. As dusk fell, the distant lights of Helena appeared on the horizon. Eleanor felt a surge of hope, tempered by concern for Yates, who rode beside her in stoic silence, his bandage now dark with blood. The territorial marshal's office was located in a sturdy brick building on Helena's main street. Despite the late hour, lamplight shone from its windows as Yates and Eleanor dismounted stiffly before its door. Inside, a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard looked up from a desk littered with papers. His eyes widened at the sight of them. Eleanor in her bedraggled riding clothes, Yates pale beneath his bloodied bandage. "Zachary," the man said, rising quickly. "I see you found trouble as usual." "Marshal Wells," Yates nodded. "This is Miss Eleanor Caldwell. She needs your protection." Wells ushered them to seats, calling for his deputy to bring water and summon a doctor. As Yates briefly explained their situation, the marshal's expression grew increasingly grave. "Thornton's men crossed territorial lines to pursue you," he said when Yates finished. "That gives me jurisdiction. I'll send deputies to intercept them tonight." He turned to Eleanor with unexpected gentleness. "Miss Caldwell, you're safe now. We've been building a case against Thornton for months. Your testimony about the arranged marriage will add weight to our investigation." "And my father?" Eleanor asked, suddenly realizing the full implications of her flight. "Will he face charges for selling me?" Wells exchanged a look with Yates. "Unfortunately, the law is murky regarding arranged marriages, but rest assured, Miss Caldwell, you're under no obligation to return to either man." As the doctor arrived to tend to Yates's wound, Marshal Wells showed Eleanor to a small adjoining room where a cot had been prepared. "Rest now," he said kindly. "Tomorrow we'll sort through your options," but sleep eluded Eleanor. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Yates in the river, putting himself between her and danger. She thought of his sister Grace, of the pain that had driven him to save a stranger from a similar fate. and she thought with growing clarity about what she wanted her future to hold. Shortly before dawn, Eleanor heard movement in the outer office. Rising quietly, she found Yates sitting alone by the cold stove, his wound cleaned and properly bandaged. "You should be resting," she said, taking the seat opposite him. "As should you," he replied with a faint smile. "Though I find sleep comes hard after days like yesterday," Eleanor nodded, understanding perfectly. "What happens now, Yates?" He looked surprised at her use of his given name, but didn't comment on it. "Marshal Wells will ensure your safety while the case against Thornton proceeds. After that." He hesitated. "My offer still stands. My sister in California would welcome you at her school." "And you?" Eleanor asked softly. "Where will you go?" Yates's gaze dropped to his hands, which were clasped loosely before him. "Wherever the marshal needs me, I suppose. That sounds very lonely." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. "It doesn't have to be," Eleanor continued finally. "Lonely, I mean." Yates looked up, his blue eyes searching her face. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying that I've spent my entire life having decisions made for me where I would live, what I would do, whom I would marry." She took a deep breath. "For the first time, I'm truly free to choose, and I find myself wanting to know more about the man who risked his life to give me that freedom." A complex emotion crossed Yates's features, hope tempered by caution. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said carefully. "I can't offer the kind of life your father's ranch provided." "I never wanted wealth," Eleanor replied. "I wanted purpose, choice, the chance to build something of my own." She reached across the space between them, tentatively touching his hand. "Perhaps, something we might build together." Yates turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "It won't be easy," he warned. "I've made enemies." "The work I do for Wells could perhaps be exchanged for something more settled," Eleanor suggested. "California needs lawmen as much as Montana territory, and I hear they have excellent schools in need of teachers." A slow smile spread across Yates's face, transforming his rugged features. "You've given this some thought." "All night," she admitted. "And throughout our journey, if I'm being honest, I've never met anyone like you, Yates Zachary, someone willing to risk everything for a stranger, yet asking nothing in return." "Not such a stranger anymore," he said softly. "No," Eleanor agreed. "Not a stranger at all." As dawn light began to filter through the office windows, they spoke of possibilities of California, of teaching and law work, of building a life neither had dared imagine days ago. When Marshal Wells returned hours later, he found them still deep in conversation, their hands intertwined on the scarred table between them. 1 month later, Eleanor stood on the platform of Helena's train station, a small valise containing her few possessions at her feet. Bartholomew Thornton had been arrested and charged with the murder of his second wife, after Eleanor's testimony helped convince a key witness to come forward. Her father, while not legally culpable, faced social ostracism when the circumstances of the arranged marriage became public knowledge. "Last call for Sacramento," the conductor shouted, moving along the platform. "Ready?" Yates asked, appearing at her side with tickets in hand. His temples still bore a faint scar from the bullet's path, but otherwise he had recovered fully. Eleanor nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the journey ahead, not just to California, but into a future of her own choosing. "Will your sister really not mind us arriving together? It's rather unorthodox." Yates smiled, taking her hand as he had that dawn in the marshal's office. "Sarah has never much cared for orthodoxy. Besides, Marshal Wells has arranged for a justice of the peace to meet us in Sacramento. We'll be respectable enough by the time we reach her school." The conductor called again, more insistently this time. Yates picked up Eleanor's valise, along with his own worn saddlebag, all that remained of their former lives, as they boarded the westbound train. As the train pulled away from Helena, Eleanor watched the mountains recede, thinking of all that had transpired since that fateful day in her father's study. She had been traded once for land, valued only for what her marriage could bring. Now she journeyed west with a man who offered something far more precious, the freedom to choose her own path, to build a life of purpose and meaning and, yes, of love, unexpected and profound. Yates's hand found hers as the train gathered speed, carrying them toward California and all its promises. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Eleanor shook her head, squeezing his fingers. "None," she replied. "This is the first decision I've made that feels entirely mine." As Montana Territory gave way to Idaho, and then to the western wilderness beyond, Eleanor Caldwell left behind the woman whose value had once been measured in acres. Beside Yates Zachary, she discovered her true worth not in land or lineage, but in courage, determination, and the freedom to forge her own destiny in the vast promise of the American West.